Orthodox. That's the main focus today, how people in the East and in the West and how they see the resurrection differently. But I'll go over for people who weren't here. Who wasn't here last time? Raise your hand. So I'll run through some of the stuff, plus a couple of things I forgot to include last time. But I'll go through it pretty quickly. If you have a question, let me know. And you ready to go? Okay. So as always, we'll start with religion in the news in the past week, but we got 2 weeks. So we'll go through that. This has been an interesting debate that's going on with Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend. And his definition, he grew up nominally a Catholic, but when he was in Oxford, he embraced Anglicanism and became very involved, and it's still very central to who he is. And he still talks about it a great deal, but he's also gay. And so Franklin Graham has been trying to make the point, and others, that they don't consider him a real Christian. His Christianity is very much focused on getting out and doing social activities and helping the poor, those sorts of things. Franklin Graham says unless he repents for being gay, he won't consider him Christian. But this is an interesting discussion because evangelical Christians have controlled the definition of what it means to be a Christian in the public sphere. But here you have someone offering a different version of Christianity that's much closer to mainline Christianity. So that's been going on the past week. This is a podcast that's become extremely popular called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And now they're going around and they'll record it. It's taking Harry Potter and they talk about it as a sacred text, how they use it to help them understand grief, how they understand compassion in there, and how we get along with each other. For this appearance in Indianapolis, they had 500 people show up. And it's part of this thing that I've tried to tell you repeatedly, and that is that people, whether they're religious or not, and last week I told you for the first time in history, there are as many people now in America who consider themselves no religion at all. Doesn't mean they're not spiritual, doesn't mean that they're not engaged or believe in God, but 23% say that they have no religious affiliation, which is the same percentage of people who consider themselves Catholic and evangelical. So we have 3/4 of the American scene now is Catholic, evangelical, and none. And when you're a nun, you are frequently, just like other people, looking for senses of transcendence, things that extend beyond yourself to give yourself meaning, and that's what's going on here. Of course, the horrible thing that happened is the Sri Lanka bombing. Did anyone see this video? It's pretty hard to watch, but they followed the guy right here all the way up the side, and then right here he came and stood right there and then set off the bomb, and everybody in the picture died as a result. And I watched the video up until the point that he gets ready to blow up everything, but it's a pretty horrible scene. And ISIS is claiming credit. It's not clear if this is in response to what happened in New Zealand, where you had someone attack a mosque. Is this the same? The horrible thing in light of this is over the last week, there are bands of young Christians, men, going around attacking Muslim homes one by one, dragging people out in the street and attacking them. So it's a pretty terrible scene. Another region I've not talked about much, and maybe we will in the future, is Egypt, where the Coptic Christians have come under a great deal of persecution. They're not allowed in the top positions in the government, and right now they're not allowed to build any churches. And in the last year, they've had 22 of their churches shut down, and they feel very much persecuted. One other thing in the international news was, I don't know if you saw, 37 Saudis were executed just this week. And these are 3 of the people executed. The guy in the middle was arrested at the age of 17 for attending a pro-democracy rally, which they said was a rebuff to the king. and they were all beheaded. But what's interesting for our purposes is one of them ended up being crucified after he was beheaded, set up a cross and hung him for 3 days, which is something like what we were talking about here. What is the purpose of crucifixions? It wasn't to kill him, it's propaganda and terror. Those are the two things that are going on. You put it out there on display to, you're saying, you better not do what this person did. So he was a student at Western Michigan and came home and was grabbed and executed. So just sort of a terrible thing, which leads us into our topic. For those who missed last week, I'll run pretty quickly through things you didn't know about the crucifixion, but half of the class knows all this stuff now. So, but if you have any questions, we'll go. What's the first image of Jesus' crucifixion? First image of Jesus, period, is somebody belittling Jesus and saying, this kid's God, he's a Christian. And this is, it makes no sense to most Romans that you would worship a guy who was executed, because that means that you're scum and that it's just not something you want to do. This is actually the first picture by Christians of Jesus in the catacombs. And he's raising Lazarus from the dead. And you see he's got a wand, because in early Christianity, there was this belief that he was engaging in magic. And there are other paintings in that. And you see no beard, no picture like what we're used to. Next question. Who invented crucifixion as a form of punishment? Does anybody remember this? It was the Persians invented it. The Greeks under Alexander the Great popularized it, and the Romans perfected it. And most of the Roman executions are like this at the top, where not one, but not two, but dozens of people. And during the Jerusalem revolt, late around the year 70 AD, Romans were executing, they were crucifying, and these were all people revolting against Rome. They were crucifying 500 people a day, day after day after day. So, I mean, that's, when we think of Jesus, it's funny, we see the crucifixion scene, it's usually one person, maybe three, but these things were done in massive amounts of people. And this is the only archaeological evidence we still have of a crucifixion, is because there was a knot in the wood and the nail went through it and they couldn't pull it out, so they just chopped off the wood. And this was discovered about 30 years ago. Next question. Why use such an inefficient method of killing? I mean, this took many people. They have 3 up here. This would take about 15 people to put this together. Why would you do this? You could easily execute someone much more effectively, just like the Saudis did. Chop off a head, throw the body in the ditch, and let the dogs eat it. That's the easiest way to go. But as I told you, it's propaganda and terror. And we do have an analogy in America. There are differences and important differences, but what would the analogy be? Anybody have a guess? What'd you say?
The Klan.
The noose, yeah, which would be like a cross, which was used again. You could easily kill a black person, or as I told you last week, there's more and more research on Hispanic people who were lynched during the last 100 years. But the noose represents something to us the same way the cross would represent something to the Christians, because this is a horrible thing. And if a Christian from the first century came here and saw all of us wearing crosses on our necklaces, they would be probably pretty freaked out because this is what they associate it with. There's up in the upper right-hand corner is a museum devoted to lynching in Montgomery, Alabama. Has anyone seen this? It's a pretty amazing thing. And then Jesse Smollett, and you can see the importance of this, of the noose as something that people care a great deal about, because that's, when he had his faked event, the guy supposedly put a noose around him, and people got very angry that you shouldn't be devaluing that as a symbol or metaphor for our society. And then why would Pilate release Barabbas? I told you it's a weird thing and I've never understood it. And that's because Barabbas was an insurrectionist who was trying to overthrow the Roman Empire. Why would a Roman authority release him? And I told you, for me, the easiest way to read it is as a metaphor. And the Jewish crowd had to choose between the nonviolent Son of God, Jesus, and Barabbas, the violent son of the father. The son of the father is what Barabbas means. And so you have two sons of the father, son of the father, lowercase, who's violent and went to overthrow the Roman Empire. And then you have the son of the father, capital F, who was nonviolent and tried to change things within the empire. And I think that's an easier way to understand that than having Pilate take somebody and return them, because with insurrectionists, you crucify them. That's what you do. You want to tell other people, don't do what this person's doing. And then who crucified Jesus, the Romans or the Jews? The answer, it would be Rome, because Jews didn't crucify. It was always the Romans who crucified. And we know the Jews did what? How did they execute? They did execute, and in the law, in the Torah, there are more than 30 provisions for executing people. We don't know if they actually carried those things out. There's not much discussion of that, but they did have a number of these things that you could execute for. But they execute by stoning, and this is James the Just, the brother of Jesus, who in the year 62 AD 62, he was the leader of the Christian community at this time, living in Jerusalem, and he got on the wrong side of the high priest, who had him stoned to death. But the community, and it's interesting, the Jewish community in Jerusalem revolted, because not only was he the leader of the church in Jerusalem, but he was the most powerful and people thought he followed the law better than anybody else in Israel. So he had the name James the Just. He followed all 600 plus laws from the Torah, and he thought those two things were compatible: staying with the law, following the law, going to temple, and being the leader of the Christian community. He's another guy I'm fascinated with and interested in, his role, because Paul becomes so important to us. We think Paul is the leader of the Christian community after Jesus' death, and he's not. And Paul and Jesus and Peter end up butting heads over their interpretations of what Christianity meant.
What happened to the people that put him to death?
They were the leaders that they were primarily would be the Sadducees, and people were going to rebel against them because the high priest worked closely with the Romans, and if you try to wipe out the head of the high priest, who's appointed usually by the Romans, you would get yourself in further trouble. So, go ahead.
What? It looks like they're pulling him.
Yeah, it's just this is like it's one of the few pictures of him, but no, he wasn't pulled apart like this. This is just a thing. It's someone's interpretation from the 14th century, but no, he was stoned, and there are multiple references to this in history. And it's interesting, he was so important that Josephus, in writing the history of the Jews, includes a whole page about James and his role within the Jewish community. Go ahead, what was your other question?
When they stone someone, who do they select to do it, and do they tie the person up?
I have no idea. In this case, he was put up against the wall of the outer city and stoned in that way. He was first thrown off the Temple Mount, and he survived that, and then he was stoned. So, yeah. But there are rules for doing it. I don't know what they are.
What is the Temple Mount?
The temple, you have the temple, Jerusalem temple, that was torn down in 70 AD. I keep on saying that, AD 70, put the AD's first, BC's after. So AD 70, but in 62 it still exists. He was up on the mount, which is huge. Anyone been to Israel, the mount still exists, and they have the western wall that still exists. He was up on the top of the temple, and someone pushed him off the top of it. And it's a pretty significant fall. I know on top, the Temple Mount's the same size as 30 football fields, but the height, it's not 100 feet, but it's a pretty big fall. Yeah, maybe I should do a class on stoning.
Scourging.
Scourging. We can just do, we can do all punishments from the Bible. Sadism and masochism in the Bible.
Who developed scourging?
Scourging, we can do scourging.
Who is responsible for that?
Again, you'll have to wait for the class. That's a broad
I just want a
umbrella.
simple yes or no. Or Romans or-
I don't know. I know much more about crucifixions. So I can tell you who started that, and you know who ended crucifixions? This is a pop quiz. If you get this, then you can, I don't know, teach the next class. It was Constantine, who in 315 decided no more crucifixions. We're not going to do this anymore. And now all the practice.
But now we have marijuana.
And now we have marijuana. That's the way to stone now? But not in Wisconsin. We'll be like the last state to allow marijuana. And then why did the Romans crucify Jesus and not his followers? I told you last week that my guess, and you can have a different guess, is, and one, they crucified him from their perspective. I want you to think about crucifixion this week from their perspective. We've heard about and seen crucifixion is understood by the early Christians and by the Jews, but from the Roman authorities' responsibility, why would they go to the extent of crucifying him? Well, that's because he was seen as someone challenging their authority. He was going to be king of the Jews. Though they might not know what the king of the Jews are, they read his ministry in political terms, and they saw this as a challenge to them. That's why they put the sign up that says King of the Jews and put it in 3 different languages, according to John. But his followers weren't killed. Most Messiah figures, they weren't only killed, but their followers were. In the year 6, AD 6, there was a guy named Judah the Galilean who was a Messiah figure and said he was going to overthrow the Romans. And he and all 3,000 of his followers were run out into the desert and executed there. So why is it that Jesus' followers were not killed? I mean, they're afraid and they think they might be. And that's a big theme. There's no one at the cross, no one at the tomb, because they're hiding and afraid that they might kill them, because it has happened with others. But why didn't they do it this time? Any guesses?
You're better at hiding.
No, I don't think that's the reason.
Not many.
Any
There's not a lot of followers.
that's an okay answer. I mean, there are some people who said that. I would just disagree. But that's one.
The movement was nonviolent?
Yeah, it's because he was not calling for a violent revolt. He was calling for a non-violent, turn the other cheek. That scares no one. And give your cloak away. All this stuff was from the perspective of the Romans again. We're not afraid of these guys. We just think if we chop off the head, the whole thing's going to die. But it didn't. But that was the issue.
We're here today.
And here are the rules that the Romans used for deciding who ended up getting killed. The authors of seditions and tumult, or those who stir up the people. Again, these are the leaders. They focus on them. Either be crucified, thrown to wild beasts, or deported to an island. Yeah, I would be happy with an island. But this is Julius Paulus telling his son how to deal with people who are, and why were there so many insurrections and Messiah figures at this time? Anybody have any thoughts or ideas about that? It's largely because the Jews were not used to, it's called the Pax Romana, time of peace, but it's peace through terror. They suppress people and tax them heavily, and there are Roman soldiers everywhere, and they're crushed and pushed down hard, and so it leads to a push back. And most of the things were shut down pretty quickly so that you could maintain the Pax Romana. So when you hear Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, this is peace through crucifixions and beheadings. That's how you maintain things. But, the Roman Empire was important for the early Christians in getting their message out, because the Romans were really good at building roads. And as a result, people could move much more quickly from one community to another and to another. That's why Paul got around everywhere. He went to all these capital cities. Without the Roman transportation system, he wouldn't have been able to do that. The spread of Christianity happens fairly quickly. It's a very small movement first, like you said, very small movement. But because of the roads, the ships, the transportation, they were able to get the message out quickly. And I told you, before Jesus' death, all Jews had views of the Messiah, and they would have views of, I said 3 of these, And it's the first three: a descendant of King David, most, not all, a priestly figure who would take over the temple and control things, a warrior figure who would bring about the kingdom of God. And the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls and preserved them, they believed there would be two Messiah figures, both the second and third. Almost nobody thought that the Messiah would be divine. When we hear the word Lord or Christ, which is the Greek translation of Messiah, or Messiah, we always associate and think it's someone who's going to be divine. Nobody thought that up until Jesus' death. And then finally, a suffering servant. They thought the Messiah would come in power and overthrow the Romans and set up the kingdom of God on earth. They didn't think the guy would be crucified. And I've told you several times that the Old Testament and New Testament they're both crisis literature. Both of them were written mainly in response to crises. In the Old Testament, it's the Babylonian exile in 586. The people in Israel are wiped out and dispersed. And those who survived said, we need to remember who we are. You might have taken us out of Israel, but we're still a people. And so they put their stories together and helped compose the Old Testament. And by the time Jesus is alive, they're not done doing that. They're still putting together texts and deciding what is canonical and what shouldn't belong in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, most of the writings there, including the Gospels, were in response to the Jewish war. Jerusalem is wiped out. All Jews and Christians are kicked out, and the temple is wiped out. So their version of what their faith is completely destroyed. And you might not think Christians, but the very last story of Paul in Acts is Paul going to the temple, spending a week going and getting immersed, purifying himself, and going up to the temple where he gets arrested. Jesus tells his disciples to go to the temple, and James is going to the temple all the time. So when the temple is destroyed, their version of their belief system is wiped out. And that's what we're going to talk about resurrection in just a second. I want you to think about it from their perspective. For us, crucifixion and resurrection are easy things to understand. But for them, they were very hard things to process. And it took them a while to do it. What was the offense committed by the two men crucified next to Jesus? We've been told since 1611, when the King James was translated, that was two thieves. That's a bad translation. If you have an NIV, if you're conservative and like the NIV, it'll say bandits. And if you have an NRSV, it'll say that they were insurrectionists. These were two people who were killing people trying to overthrow the Roman Empire. There's no reason to put thieves up on crosses. You just chop their heads off. You don't have to do anything complicated. Because, it sends a message, but that's not the worst offense around. So that's, and here's the Passion Play in Germany, and I can never say very good. You're very good Lutherans. What's that? You have to share with everybody, guys. And what are we to do with all the contradictions in the crucifixion and resurrection? Yes. The hardest thing about the Bible is the contradictions on these two things, these two issues, are the most profound, the most pronounced of any in the Bible. And so what do you do with those things? I say keep them all. You can read Mark, and in Mark, the despair that goes on is greater than it is in any of the three. You can feel, if you read Mark, the whole my God, why have you left me, and all that stuff. That feels like a Good Friday service. And in John, Jesus is super powerful, and when the soldiers come to arrest him, they all collapse when they realize it's Jesus, and he says, get up, and let's get on with this. I got something to do. I got to die tomorrow. And I was thinking while I was at a service the other day, just how quick this was. So Thursday night, they have the meal. And to show you what sort of contradictions it is, in three of the Gospels, it's a Passover meal. In John, it's not. And in John, Jesus is the Passover lamb who's executed. So I'm okay with that. One's making a theological statement, the other one's making a more historical argument. That's the way it works. But John is what you should feel on Easter Sunday morning. It's that sort of uplifting story. And we did Luke this year, and there are things in Luke that you don't find anywhere else, including this. Salvation doesn't happen just with the death of Jesus and the resurrection. It happens today. Today a Savior's born. Today the Scripture is fulfilled. Today we have seen strange things. Today I must stay at your house. Today salvation has come to this house. Today you will see me in paradise. So the urgency of it is something that I love. If you end up merging all of these things into one, you lose those things. Anybody disagree?
Preach on, bro.
What's that?
I'm preaching.
No, it's just funny because in almost every service about the Easter, you will hear them merge everything. So you end up with a gospel that doesn't exist anywhere. You have the gospel according to one preacher. So I'm okay with the contradictions and the disagreements. And apparently the people who put the New Testament together were the same. They were aware that there were differences in the text. It's us who are uncomfortable with those contradictions. Now let's talk about the resurrection. And for the early church, this is very confusing. You can tell by the response of the people who witnessed the resurrection. Why was it so confusing? Acts 1. So when they had come together, they asked him. They're together in Jerusalem. Jesus is appearing to them. And what did they say? Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom of Israel? When we have Easter service, does anyone here think, oh, it's now time for us to restore the kingdom of Israel? It makes no sense at all. But it made all the sense in the world to them. And I'll explain to you in a second. In Matthew, he appears to them. They're with him. And it says, and when they saw Jesus, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Not just Thomas, but lots of people doubted. They were confused. This doesn't make any sense. And as we discussed last week, there's a difference, and I changed it. I changed one of the definitions. I'll admit that right up front because of the questions you guys asked. I do listen to you. Ascension is when a heroic or godly individual disappears mysteriously from the earth and reappears from heaven or with God. And this doesn't just apply to Jews. Romans believed in ascensions. They believed there were military figures and emperors who ascended to heaven. Julius Caesar is one of them. One guy was made a senator because he supposedly witnessed Julius Caesar ascending to heaven, even though we know what actually happened to Julius Caesar. But they had belief in ascension. It was usually one person who was mighty and stood out. And I'll test your Old Testament knowledge. There are three people who are discussed as being as ascending, never dying and going straight to heaven. Two of them are explicit, and the stories are told. Who are those two or three people? Elijah's one, Enoch, and then Moses is one where in Jewish literature the belief is, it says in Deuteronomy that he just goes straight up to, that he's buried and no one knows where it is. In Midrash tradition, that's just covering up the fact that he was actually ascended and that he never was buried. Resurrection's a completely different thing. And that is, the belief at the time among the Jews is that deceased people are brought back to life and they're dead. Unlike the people who ascend, they're dead. And they're brought back to life in immortal versions of their heavenly bodies. So your bones and your body stays together, but you're in an immortal version, not immoral, of their earthly bodies to live in a peaceful and just world that's ruled by God. And that last part is a peaceful and just world ruled by God. That's the kingdom of God. We today think kingdom of God means heaven. Well, to them, this is what the kingdom of God was. God would come and rule on earth through a Messiah figure. So those are two different things. And somebody asked last week about Lazarus, because he's not in either of these categories, is he? What would he be? Or resuscitation. One of those things. He's brought back to life, but then he eventually dies. He doesn't have an immortal body. It's the same body. So he's resuscitated, and he goes on to live. There are other figures like that. Did someone raise their hand? Yeah, go ahead.
Did the Jewish people believe necessarily in life after death?
And you know, I really love that question because next year I'm going to teach a class on things that almost never appear in the Old Testament, but then are all over the place in the New Testament. One, heaven and hell. You don't have heaven and hell in the Old Testament. But when you get to the New Testament, that's all people can talk about, is heaven and hell. Jesus talks about it all the time. So where did it come from? Resurrection, another one. There are a couple slight references, and I'll mention them in a second. But there's the dry bones stuff in Ezekiel, but that's more metaphorical. There is a discussion in one book of the Old Testament that mentions an actual resurrection, but it emerges in that period between the last book of the Old Testament and the new one, and what was going on that made this become such a big thing. And then the third subject that appears during this time are angels. You have some angels in the Old Testament, frequently they're actually God, the angel of the Lord. In some instances becomes the Lord, and it's just sort of a dressing up early in the Old Testament, but not too much. And in the New Testament, if you read Revelation, angels are everywhere, fighting here, fighting there, good angels, bad angels. Satan becomes a bad angel, which in the Old Testament, he's not a bad angel. So all these things, so I want to teach a class on that, so thanks, Kevin, for, I know I told you to ask the question, but you did a good job. Go ahead.
Isn't there some reference to Sheol or a place?
Sheol, yeah, which for some people, like Samuel goes to Sheol, but it's a dark, dismal place that nobody wants to go. But no, it's not hell.
Is it a
And
waiting place or?
waiting for what? It's just sort of like a,
To go?
you know, how would you think about it? It would be like being stuck in your basement for the rest of your life. Or you're just there, it's dank and unpleasant, and there aren't very many people there, but the whole thing emerges and we end up with hell. But there's a lot of stuff going on in between that idea. But for most Jews, the belief was if you did something right here, you're rewarded here. If you do something bad here, according to Deuteronomy, you get stuck, you get hit. And so do 4 generations of people beyond you. But there's a theological crisis that occurs when people who are Jewish do good things, they follow the Torah, but they end up getting hit in a bad way. Job is one example, but the biggest story and the one that drives it is an incident that leads to Hanukkah, when Antiochus Epiphanes IV starts saying, if you teach your kids Torah or circumcise them, I will execute you. You can't fit this into Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy says you teach the law to your kids, you'll be rewarded. But in fact, the exact opposite was happening. So how do you deal with that? So that's resurrection. We're going to talk about it some more. And I did this. It shouldn't say reign of Satan. It's the reign of evil forces. Satan is a concept that's in transition when Jesus dies. I mean, it's there. He talks about him and so forth. But it wasn't always thought this way. But this is a very simple way of seeing how the Jews thought when Jesus died. Okay, first, they thought a Messiah comes. And they thought it was Jesus. But then he gets executed. So this isn't going right. And then there was a resurrection of everybody that was supposed to occur when Jesus was on earth. Everybody, a universal act. Everyone who's died, or most people who've died, especially those who've done good things, would come back to life and live forever. And from that point on, we would have a reign of God. So these 3 things are connected. Messiah comes, resurrection, and the reign of God. And the interesting thing was, what was the first question they asked in the Acts? He comes back, and Jesus is there, and they say, the Messiah's here. He's clearly the Son of Messiah. God has confirmed that he's Messiah. So shouldn't the reign of God start occurring right now? And then the question others started asking was, what about the resurrection of everybody else? We have no concept of a resurrection of one. That's just not something that makes sense to me. Go ahead.
How about Matthew, where you get the earthquake and the resurrection?
The pastors are not allowed to ask questions. Former pastors, people who've read the Bible. This is for Lutherans, guys, okay? Go ahead.
You're speaking of, there was a reference to the devil when he was tempted, the 40 days.
Yeah, right. And that's what I said. The concept is emerging, and it's not. And Satan in the Old Testament is more like the term that they use is like a prosecuting attorney. And God's the judge, and he brings a case against somebody, and he'll tempt people and do things like that. He isn't a terrible person in Job. He's becoming a terrible person in the intertextual period, and then he starts to emerge as someone who's in Jesus' day, who is this embodiment of evil.
But in Job, aren't they going back and forth, like the devil's challenging God?
It's, first of all, it's not the devil, it's Satan. The devil doesn't exist. Like, you know, we call the snake in the garden the devil. There's no reference to a devil anywhere. It's Satan, and Satan means someone who is challenging someone. As I told you, it's like a prosecuting attorney who's making a case that you've said this. I'm not really sure that's true, so let's test this out on somebody. Why don't we charge this guy, Job, who's supposedly so great, and see how he stands up with these theories and ideas that you've been applying. So he's not seen as a terrible person. He's seen more as a devil's advocate. But go ahead.
When the earthquake did happen and people started rising from the dead, did they mention, and I don't recall them mentioning them being good people.
I'm going to get to that in just a second.
Well,
So the understanding is that, and I know this is supposed to be a little disconcerting to you. So this is how they processed it. If you were there then, you would think the exact same thing. If you're in the upper room with Jesus, you're trying to put this together. And you've got to come up with a way to put it all together. And just a quick thing, people there were expecting to be resurrected with their actual physical bodies, but they would become, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, they would become spiritual bodies. So you could touch them like Thomas could touch you, but you weren't going to die. You don't decompose. So it was important to keep your bones together. So during this period, like a 100-year period, people had bone boxes. And this is Caiaphas's bone box, which is amazing. His name's written on the side. It's an amazing discovery. And at the Israel Museum, it's the most popular thing there because it's an actual historical figure. And people after a year would return and collect all your bones and put them in the box for preservation for the resurrection. Now, someone asked the question about Jews. 99% of Jews today don't believe in an afterlife. They think that you continue your life in your children, your relatives, and that sort of thing. So the ideas about resurrection, they're all in flux in this first century period. Christians go one way, and the rabbinic Jews, or the Jews that come after the people who are Jews today, they go in a separate direction, okay? So how did they deal with this conflict? They went to their Old Testament. They went back to their scripture. They went and read these things and said, let's try to figure out this stuff. Now, when we interpret the Bible, we try for the most part to understand what it was written for originally. And the early apostles and disciples did not use the Bible that way. They used it to understand things back then, but also to understand things that are going on with them right now. And so the suffering Messiah, something that never existed before, they start reading passages that we read during Easter week and make sense to us now. It wasn't something that was part of the way they understood things. So Isaiah 53, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. What do you think that was about originally? Anybody have a guess? It's talking about the universal, how the world is going to come together in the end, and we're going to set aside our swords and stuff, and we're going to eventually all worship the God of Israel. And Israel is the one carrying that message, and they've been through a lot. They were destroyed here and there, and the he is Israel. And it's because of them that all people originally will get salvation. But the people in the early church read this text and said, that's Jesus. Okay? That's their first part of putting these things together. Son of Man, he's a weird character in the book of Daniel. Jesus talked about him, but frequently he talked about him like he was another guy. And Jesus said the Messiah will come back and there will be a Son of Man. And the Son of Man, I talked about it a little bit last week, was, the Son of Man receive dominion, splendor, and kingship. All nations, peoples, and tongues will serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away. His kingship, one that shall not be destroyed. He's talked about as if he's a divine figure. Not quite God, who's called the Almighty One and the Ancient One in this text, but they said he was always talking about this. The Son of Son of Man is Jesus. He's not just the Messiah, but he's also this figure from there. And then finally, when does all this happen? So originally, they thought when Jesus comes to be resurrected, everybody was supposed to be resurrected, and that didn't happen. But there emerged this idea that Jesus was going to come again, and that's when the resurrection would happen. So in Daniel 12, and many of those who sleep, you're right, it's not everybody. You're asking, does everybody who's good emerge? It says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall wake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Okay, so there's a resurrection. Everybody agrees with this. It didn't happen when Jesus died, but it happened. It's going to happen. And then finally, Jesus is the sacrificial lamb. By his wounds we are healed, as we saw up above. So these are things, ways that people put this stuff together. And I told you there's a crisis going on during this time. They're trying very hard to understand what happened. And you can see actually this idea. They thought the second coming was going to come right away. In 1 Thessalonians, the people are freaking out because people are dying. And they're telling Paul, we thought everybody's going to be resurrected. And Paul's just like, hang on, it's going to come any day. It's going to come. And if you read 1 Thessalonians 4, that's sort of his message. It's going to happen anytime. And then someone wrote 2 Thessalonians, which is, okay, let's not worry about when it's going to happen or when it's not going to happen. So that's one of the crises. And then the second one is when the temple is destroyed. Oh, one other one is Paul. When Paul talks about the resurrection, he calls it the first fruits of the resurrection. That means this is going to be the first of them, and then everybody's going to. We're in this first category, and then we're going to move on. So you have emerging an individual resurrection, but the Jewish thinking is still that it's a universal resurrection. Okay? You have these two competing ideas going on, and neither of them is dead today. They both exist. Oh, the passage you like. When Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. So this is more like the universal resurrection. It's still embedded in Scripture. We find things like this around that indicate there were still people who believed the universal resurrection happened. Okay? So how do people in the West? We've tended to interpret these things, and this becomes an art lesson now. We've seen things more and more over time that the resurrection is all about Jesus. And we came up with this idea about sacrificial atonement. He died for our sins, and when we die, we're going to be reconciled with God in heaven because of him. And this is the first two I'll show you. Early on, the early Christians adopted the Jewish idea that if someone is God, you shouldn't represent them. So the idea emerged, and this is from the year 420. This is a casket that existed in France. And France in the 420 was a big part of where Christianity was going on. So you have three scenes at the top. You have you have Jesus with the cross, and then you have him on the cross, which is apparently our first real picture by a Christian artist of Jesus on the cross. But then you have the resurrection, and they believed at this point that's when he became God, and it's an empty tomb. They don't have any picture. He's not there. You don't see him. Who do you see there in this bottom left-hand corner?
Looks like he's peeking through the door.
Okay, the door's open here. He's gone. You can see the tomb in here. It's split open, and these are the two guards. They look like they might be asleep. And then you have the women who went there to the tomb. The one weird thing is, does that look like any tomb that you imagined? This is actually the, what's the tomb in Jerusalem, the main temple? the main Christian church in Jerusalem. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Constantine's mom had built this over top of where they believe that Jesus rose, and it looks like this. And you find something like that also in some Muslim and mosques and stuff like that. So you'll see this image again and again and again, because there was no representation of what what the tomb looked like. So they took what existed in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Here's another one. This is from the year 350. So a little bit earlier than the other one. And this is found in the Vatican. It's a sarcophagus on the side. You have Simon carrying the cross. You have the soldier putting the thorns. Then you have Jesus appearing before Pilate. You have Pilate washing his hands. And in the middle here, you have the resurrection. And who are the two guys at the bottom? Those are the guards again. One asleep, the other one witnessing it and terrified. And Jesus is represented by the circle in the middle. It's a Chi-Rho, and they didn't want to have a picture of Jesus, so this is what it is. It's also interesting, this is an eagle up here. It's holding the wreath, which many people interpret it to mean that Rome was working hand in hand with the early church. Rome is represented by an eagle holding the wreath, which is Jesus. So I want you to focus on this part and above. Here's Jesus. And there are other pictures in which Jesus is halfway out of the tomb. And there are pictures of him just sitting up in the tomb in Western art. This is one where he's halfway out of the tomb. He's not completely out. And what do we have there? We have the two women again. The two women are essential in all of these stories. And you have the angel talking to them, and you have Isaiah over here. And then you have the soldiers once again. This is actually very close to what goes on in the book of Matthew. Okay, so the focus becomes more and more on Jesus as the Lord and Savior through his single resurrection. And here he is coming out of the tomb, and the two angels there. But down here at the bottom is this sort of weird thing, and we're going to see this again and again. It's a bunch of guards and evil people. It's a representation of Hades. Okay, and we're going to see this more in the Eastern art, but just remember that for now. And here are the women who've come to the tomb. This is from a missal, a book where they've drawn this stuff that was in Germany in the year 1130. And then here are two more representations. Jesus is clearly cleared out. He's on his own. He's risen above. He is the resurrection. But in the East, we have a very different image. Here he is. It's called the anastasis. That's the term they use to refer to the resurrection. And this is one of our early ones. This is Jesus standing on. He's standing on Hades, and you'll see some locks and chains broken away. This is Adam, and in his resurrection, he's pulling up mankind. Mankind comes to life with Jesus. And the idea is, you also see him with a cross, which you didn't see in any of the others. The idea is his crucifixion represented this horrible, violent activity that happened to Jesus. But he was able to triumph, and not just triumph, but he was able to resurrect everybody who existed before him and took them with him. Okay? This is on the right, and it's more representations. They represent Israel. This is David with the beard and Solomon with the hat without the beard. And this is Eve. And behind it, it's just the original artist called it the prophets. Now this is the anastasis on a church in Romania. Jesus has two hands, and he's pulling out Adam and Eve in this particular situation. So it's not just mankind; it's mankind and womankind. And then once again, you have Hades. He looks nasty. Jesus is trampling them, and the locks have been broken. And Jesus is able, through his resurrection, to overturn what happened to him in the crucifixion. And this is another one from Romania. It's in the year 1500. But if you go to an Eastern Orthodox church, a Greek Orthodox, an OCA church, any of those churches, you'll find this anastasis all over the place. Because, as I said, it's a collective thing that happened. It wasn't just about Jesus dying and saving me and taking care of my individual sins. It's the whole of the world is coming together. The resurrection is important because it defeated death for everybody, not just for Jesus and those particular people. But then you have down here 2 angels binding up Hades, still standing on them again, and Jesus has one hand and the other, and because both hands are taken up, he has above him an angel carrying the cross. And again, the cross never changes. It's in almost all of these scenes. I'm going to show you one where it doesn't appear, but almost always the idea is he's defeating death. The cross represents death, and that's what we're doing. And you know, occasionally we get references to this. There's one of our creeds says, what happens during the time Jesus is dead? He descended to the dead. What's going on there? There's a reference also in one of the 2 books of Peter talking about that Jesus goes down to Hades and deals with those people there.
Crucifixion?
Yeah, and that's, do you want to tell us what that is?
Well, it's the idea of conquering the victor of evil, conquering evil. The gates of hell cannot prevail against. We sing
It's a very different understanding of what actually happens at resurrection. You know who adopted and agreed with Christus Victor? That's one of several different ways of understanding how resurrection worked. Martin Luther, he was a big supporter of Christus Victor. He thought this is what happens. It's not just about you and your individual sins. This is a collective thing. This is something for all of us, and it's definitely a defeat for the system that executed him. That violent earthly kingdom that we saw back here, this reign of Satan, the earthly kingdom is destroyed. And so this Jewish understanding of resurrection is carried through and maintained in the Eastern Church. And on the Western side, our world, we've identified and we see the resurrection as a unitary singular thing, which is not what they agreed. It's a complete reinterpretation, which is fine. They're trying to make meaning out of what happened because they're as disoriented as we are when we hear these things. And it takes us back to probably the prettiest, the most attractive anastasis picture, which I showed earlier, right here, where you have Adam on one side, Mary on the other. You have David with the shepherds thing. Over here, you have John the Baptist at the front, and other people. But this is from the 1400s. Once again, this is in Germany, and the British Museum bought it, and now the Getty Museum bought it. And so you can see this at the Getty Museum if you go there. So that's something. I don't know if you guys have ever thought about this, but this is a different way when you go through resurrection and the Easter story next time. Think that there are these different things, these traces of understanding of a universal resurrection still out there. It's still in our Bible. It's still in our creed. But also this individual thing. It doesn't have to be either or. You can think about it in both those terms, but it's a way to think about the resurrection. Go ahead.
Who's the guy on the floor there?
On the floor down here, that's Hades again. And just so you know, I told you last week, one confusing thing is our Bible has a lot of stories in it, but one story it doesn't have is the story of the resurrection. He's in there, and then there's an empty tomb. We don't know what happened. There's one book that's out there. It's a Gnostic gospel, one that we don't normally read. It's called the Gospel of Peter, and it's about the only thing that's been saved from that, and that is there's a bolt of lightning, and then there's 2 very large angels and another person whose head goes as high as the clouds, and the soldiers can just see that person from here to here, and then a cross comes out behind the 2 of them, and the soldiers say, what's going on? And they explain this is the resurrection. It's an interesting thing. There's also the story of Jesus doing this and trampling down the evil is in another gospel from the 400s called the Gospel of Bartholomew, which we don't read. But it's very, very similar, except for the person he's trampling on is not Hades, but it's Satan. And this is not Sheol, but this is hell. So there are those differences in it.
So excuse me, who are these people on either side that he's holding on to?
Adam
Adam's on your left?
on my
our
left, and Eve is on the right. They represent mankind and womankind. He's pulling up everybody with him.
Okay.
This is not just it's not just about him and those people. He's taking it's a universal resurrection that's occurring.
And who are the people
They're just
with
various.
the
They're
halos?
various. They're various people from the Old and New Testament. And they're leaders like David and Solomon are up there. They represent the Jewish community. Just various. John the Baptist is up there. I can run through all of them with you if you want to know afterwards.
Who are the people without the halos?
Those are Old Testament figures. These are New Testament figures.
Okay, gotcha. All right.
And there's also this thing, the almond-shaped thing behind
Yeah,
him.
what's that? Like seashell thing?
That's very common in Eastern, and it's similar to the halo. We have the halo. In Eastern Christianity, they have both, and it's called the mandorla, and that means almond. But it's in Eastern art that he is, after his death and his resurrection, he is totally entombed in this spiritual sort of body, this spiritual halo, the entire thing, and it only occurs after the anastasis, after the resurrection, and after that, then he's pulling these two into it with him. They're all going to be within this spiritual and peaceful community.
Is this Isaiah 3 eschatology here? This every coming together?
Yeah, it is that in the end that the everything's going to be reconciled. Gentiles, Jews, and it'll be a peaceful kingdom.
We do the worst, but God does the best. Suffering servant.
Right, that's what I said. This is all part of trying to understand all that confusion that's going on. And these people on the East have hung on to that part about the universal resurrection. On the West, we've dropped it. It's not something, and so when you read that he descended to the dead, it's just a weird line. It doesn't mean anything. Or you read that passage in Matthew, what's going on there? It looks like a zombie, a conference of zombies running around. It makes no sense to us at all, but that's a residual, something that still exists and something that's still there. And it's confusing to us in the East, in the West, but people in the West, in the East, I get them both wrong, but people in the East understand it perfectly. This makes sense. This is part of the general resurrection that occurred with his death. Any other questions? Go ahead.
It just occurs to me just now, but although it refers to the crucifixion, Jesus' statements, if I be raised up, will draw all men unto myself.
Yeah, that's good.
So it has a resurrection.
Right, thing to the, another thing, I told you that the funny thing is, there are these crises that occur, and the ones I listened to weren't the only ones. There's the crisis when the guy you followed and thought was the Messiah dies and is crucified in an incredibly embarrassing way. Man, we are completely wrong. And then there's a resurrection appearance, and these people see him, and it's like, but he's supposed to be resurrected, and everybody else is supposed to go, what's going on there? So they read the Bible and they come to understand it, and they say the second coming is going to happen soon, and then a decade goes by, another decade goes by, another decade goes by, and people have to reinterpret and understand what exactly is happening there. Paul says it's this resurrection. Jesus says that the Messiah will come before many of you people die in Mark, and then Paul repeats that, says it's going to happen anytime. Some of you shouldn't even get married because you don't have time. This thing's going to happen in 1 Corinthians. So if you want to get out of like an engagement, just go to 1 Corinthians, look it up. I wish I could, but it's just not. This isn't the time. That's what Paul said. Could happen any moment. And then the fourth thing is the crisis when the temple is destroyed, because the temple for early Christians was the center of their faith, and so that gets wiped out. Just like with the Jews, the temple is destroyed, and the Torah becomes the center of their faith, and that's why we have so many Talmudic scholars, people trying to understand it, because that's now the center of their faith. For us, Jesus becomes the center of the faith. But we still have a discussion going on, what did his resurrection actually mean? So,
What about Donald Trump putting the Capitol
this is really throwing us, aren't you?
in Jerusalem
Oh, yeah.
and the Jews return to Jerusalem? That is the, then all will be peace. And
Yeah, that's a particular reading by evangelicals, and evangelicals supported Donald Trump in a big way. I don't think he came up with that idea on his own. Yeah, while he was reading 2 Corinthians, he came up with that. No, but I understand. Yeah, I mean, there are people who are trying to force the second coming by thinking if they do certain things, if they bring all the Jews, or if they rebuild the temple, or if they have a red heifer, yeah. And if none of those things mean anything to you, great. It shouldn't be in your head, and I've spent 50 years trying to get it out of my head. But yeah, there are people who are trying to bring this whole thing together. So, well, thank you very much. That's our question.